So first off, thank you everybody for joining today's webinar, where the topic is CSD regulation, settlement discipline, with particular focus on mandatory buy-ins. So in terms of the agenda for this webinar, we will start off by quickly looking at what CSD regulation settlement discipline is, and particularly the provisions for mandatory buy-ins. We'll then look at conventional buy-ins, the buy-ins that exist today in the OTC market, and compare these with the CSDR mandatory buy-in provisions. Amongst the differences will be the CSDR mandatory buy-in asymmetry, which is a very important consideration in terms of risk management. We'll then look at the potential risks and adverse behavioral impacts of the buy-in regime. We'll quickly look at the challenges of applying this to securities financing transactions. And then we'll finally wrap up with what ICMA is doing with respect to settlement discipline. So what is CSD regulation? Well, it's an EU regulation that introduces measures for the authorization and regulation of the EU Central Securities Depositories, or CSDs. Now, most of the regulation focuses on issues related to the prudential, organizational, and business standards of CSDs. However, some of its requirements directly relate to trading and trading level entities that settle on EU CSDs, in particular the measures to address settlement fails. These measures are known or packaged as settlement discipline, found in Chapter 3 of the regulation. Article 7 of the regulation provides for measures to address settlement fails. And there are two main tenets to this. One is a cash penalty mechanism, which will be operated by the CSDs, which essentially will apply a penalty rate to parties that fail to settle their transactions, and then award that penalty to the party to which they're failing. Second tenet is far more controversial and has created far more problems from an implementation perspective, and that's mandatory buy-ins. So before we get into mandatory buy-ins, what is the scope of CSDR settlement discipline? Well, it applies to all transactions that are intended to settle on an EU CSD, and it applies to transferable securities, money market instruments, UCITS, and emission allowances, which are admitted to trading or are traded on a trading venue or cleared by a CCP. You can probably see the MiFID language already being applied. Importantly, it applies to all trading level entities regardless of their domicile. In other words, it relates to the transactions that are settled on EU regulated CSDs. It's not any difference on your domicile or your jurisdiction. Everybody, as we will see, who trades on an EU CSD is theoretically brought into scope. In terms of the buy-in, we'll look at some of the aspects of that a bit more closely in a moment, but it's important to remember that it is a regulatory requirement. It is not a contractual right, as in current day. It is a requirement. It's also worth mentioning that securities financing transactions are also brought into scope. You could argue that they're also brought indirectly into scope, and that all SFTs will be affected, something we will look at a little later. But in terms of direct application of mandatory buy-ins, SFTs that are termed for 30 business days or longer will be in scope. Now, as I mentioned, it applies to all transactions that meet the criteria that settle on an EU CSD, regardless of where the trading counterparties are located. So you could be a New York entity trading with a Hong Kong entity, but if your trade, which could be in a Colombian dollar bond, is due to settle on an ICSD, you will be in scope. It will be brought into scope through the contractual arrangements and procedures, which are outlined in the regulatory technical standards. These are designed to ensure that all parties are brought into scope. Essentially, this will be the contractual arrangements that firms will have with their clearing agents, with their settlement agents, with CSDs if they're direct participants, and with trading venues. So when does it apply? Well, CSDR was actually passed into law some time ago in August 2014. The regulatory technical standards were finally submitted by ICMA in February 2016. It took a while and 2 consultations with the market before the RTS were finalized. Then they were sat on by the European Commission for 2 years and finally adopted in May of 2018. Following a 3-month period for scrutiny by the Parliament and the Council, they were finally published in the official journal in September 2018. The provisions provide for a 20-month delay before application. So the regulation, including mandatory binds, will become live in September 2020. Well, a good starting point is to look at how conventional binds work. If you were, say, trading the ICMA bind rules in the market. Generally, if you fail or are failed to on a transaction, you have the right to issue a buy-in, which means you can source the securities elsewhere, cancel your trade with the original counterparty. Any difference in the cost of the new securities and the original trade price are settled between the 2 parties. Traditionally, this would be done through appointing a buying agent. It's a third party, usually a market maker in the securities, who will go into the market and source the securities for you at the best available price for guaranteed delivery, which is an important consideration as well. Buy-ins are usually for guaranteed delivery, whereas regular transactions are for best efforts. It's also important to remember that with a standard buy-in, the differential between the new buy-in price and the original transaction can be settled in either direction. And as we will see, this is quite a critical consideration. And it's important that this can happen because the purpose of a buy-in is not to penalize anybody. The purpose of a buy-in is to force settlement of a trade. And therefore, it restores both parties or multiple parties in the event of a buy and pass on to the original economics of the trade. Nobody should be advantaged or disadvantaged. It is merely a mechanism, a risk management tool for ensuring settlement of securities. It's also important to remember that they're discretionary, that the party who can fail to has the right to issue the buy-in whenever they want. This allows for time to negotiate with the failing party. It also means that if they need to execute a buy-in, they can choose the optimal time when liquidity is at the most opportune level, for instance. It also means that multiple fails can be solved with one buy-in, as we will see in a moment. Let's just look at the economics of a conventional buy-in. And I've used a very simple example here. 2 counterparties, A and B. A sells some bonds to B, and B pays the price, $98.50. Let's assume A fails to B. B now has the right to issue a buy-in. We'll assume you use a buy-in agent. So they appoint the buy-in agent who goes into the market, and in our first scenario, they source the bonds at a price of 99. 99 is higher than the original trade price. So when B cancels the trade with A will make a payment of that differential, 50 cents. A will pay B. Think about it, all parties are restored to where they would have been. B pays 50 cents more than the original transaction, but they receive 50 cents from A. It's the equivalent of having securities in 98.50. A now has their position again. their mark to market is actually 50 cents higher than where they originally sold. So they're 50 cents better off. But after paying B the 50 cents, they're in the same boat. What if the buying price is lower? In the second scenario, the buying agent sources the bonds at 98, 50 cents lower than the original transaction. B now gets the bonds cheaper, 50 cents cheaper than the original trade. They pay 50 cents to A. A has a mark to market that is 50 cents lower than their original sale, which is cancelled, but they receive 50 cents. Everybody is restored to the original position that they would have been in had the trade settled. So moving on to the regulatory buy-ins, the CSDR mandatory buy-ins, and the salient points. Well, firstly, they're executed at trading level, which is similar to a conventional buying mechanism. These are market transactions affect trading parties. This might not sound so strange, but if you take a closer look at the original level 1, the idea was that actually it might not be the trading parties controlling the buying process. It would be the CSD participants, the settlement agents, or even the trading venues who would be responsible. It was only through the level 2 consultation that pointed out to ICMA pretty much impossible in the real world. So mostly, and it's not exclusively, mostly the CSDR mandatory buy-ins are expected. For non-centrally cleared trades, it requires the appointment of a buying agent. Now, those of you familiar with the ICMA buying rules will know that this requirement was removed back in 2017 due to market demand. It was becoming very difficult to find buying agents. Market makers had no interest in acting as buying agents. So it actually became much simpler for firms to elect to execute their own buy-ins within certain criteria. That will not be possible under CSDR. Also, as I mentioned, buy-ins are generally discretionary, not under the regulation. The buy-in process is automatically triggered. And this will be 4 business days after intended settlement date for liquid equities, liquid being defined by the FIR definition, and 7 business days for all other securities, including bonds. This period is called the extension period. And it's important to emphasize that it is a regulatory requirement that after 4 days for liquid equities and 7 business days of failing for all other securities, the failed to counterparty must start the buy-in process. The buy-in process timing is also prescriptive. It's 4 business days for liquid equities, 7 business days for everything else. And this means the time from starting the buy-in process to settling the buy-in. Now, what happens if a buy-in isn't possible? Well, there is the option for the failed to party to initiate one more attempt, known as a deferral period. If they do not go for this option, or the deferral period is also unsuccessful, the trade will result in cash compensation. And cash compensation means that the trade is cancelled and a payment is made by the failing party to the failed to party. And the level 2 sets out the methodology for establishing what cash compensation should be, but essentially it's based on an estimate of where the market is using, in the case of fixed income, most likely broker quotes or written trades on venues. Previously mentioned, securities financing transactions, so repos and securities lending, are in scope where they are termed for 30 business days or longer. Finally, it's one of the key features of CSDR mandatory buy-ins, along with the very prescriptive timings. Payment of the buy-in or the cash compensation is asymmetrical. In other words, it can only be paid in one direction. So if you think of our previous example of a standard buy-in, a conventional buy-in, where the payment can go in either direction between the parties, depending on whether the buy-in price is higher or lower, that doesn't apply to CSDR mandatory buy-ins. It can only be paid in one direction where the buy-in price is higher, and it's not paid at all if it's lower. So I guess the key question is why? We'll come to that in a moment. I'm just going to summarize some of the key differences between standard conventional buy-ins, such as the ICMA buy-in rules and CSDR. ICMA buy-in rules are discretionary, can be initiated at any time. CSDR, it's mandatory, set times. It's the non-defaulting party can elect when the buy-in will take place, the actual period, between 4 and 10 days from when they start. The non-defaulting party under CSDR has to start the buy-in process immediately and within a set period. Conventional buy-ins, the process can run indefinitely. Under CSDR, it must be completed within a set timeline. As mentioned, ICMA buy-in rules, there's no requirement to appoint a buy-in agent. Under CSDR, for non-centrally cleared trades, you do have to appoint a buy-in agent. The buy-in differential can go in both directions under a conventional buy-in, not under CSDR. Cash compensation is certainly possible under conventional buy-ins, but not prescribed. It is prescribed and is compulsory in the event that a buy-in cannot successfully completed. ICMA buy-in rules have a pass-on mechanism, which provides for a single buy-in to settle an entire chain of fails. There is no pass-on mechanism under CSDR, and as we will see, it probably wouldn't work anyway. ICMA buy-in rules apply to all firms trading under the ICMA rules, usually members in international securities, which is actually a very, very broad definition of securities. The ICMA rules form part of the contractual trading agreements between member firms and also between member firms and non-member firms in certain circumstances. And CSDR, this is not contractual, it is regulatory. It applies to all transactions intended to settle on an EU CSD in certain securities. So why the asymmetry? Well, it appears to be the result of drafting error. If you look at the level 1 text, Article 7.6, I've highlighted here, it states where the price of the shares agreed at the time of the trade is higher than the price paid for the execution of the buy-in, the corresponding difference shall be paid to the receiving participant by the failing participant. Well, it appears to be the wrong way round. For a conventional buy-in, where they've written higher, it should be lower. Or if it was meant to be higher, then the corresponding difference shall be paid by the receiving participant to the failing participant. It's generally considered to be an error. Now, unfortunately, errors in the level 1 cannot be corrected, or at least not in CSDR. So the Commission passed it on to ICMA to try and deal with this through the level 2 process in the regulatory technical standards. Having sought legal advice, the best that ICMA could do within the constraints of the level 1 was to ensure that where the buy-in price is higher than the original transaction price, the payment can go in the right direction, i.e. from the failing party to the fail to party. But where it is lower, in other words, where the securities, the price of the securities in the original trade are higher than those in the buy-in, the payment is deemed paid. So this is where the asymmetry comes from. And this creates a number of problems. I'll try and illustrate here. We use our original example for a conventional buy-in. A sells some bonds to B pays 98.50, A fails, B appoints a buy-in agent goes into the market. If the price is higher, again, we're going to use the example of 99. The bonds get passed on to B at 99. Trade with A gets cancelled. A pays 50 cents to B because of the 50 cent differential. You can see from the P&L charts on the right, everybody is back in the position that they would have been. Nobody is worse off than the bonds. But if it's lower under CSDR, we now have a problem. If the buy-in agent sources of bonds at 98 and then passes them on to B. B cancels the trade with A, but whereas conventionally they would make a payment to A, in this scenario, they don't have to. It's being paid. B now sources those securities 50 cents cheaper. A, who has their trade cancelled and now has a market 50 cents below the original sale, is 50 cents worse off. It changes the economics of the original trade. What's more, it changes the economics to the same degree as the differential between the original price and buying price. It's the economic equivalent of whenever somebody sells a security, also writing a free at-the-money put that becomes active in the event of a buy-in. The lower the buy-in price is beneath the original transaction price, the more windfall profits the bought-in the counterpart, the failed to counterparty will make, and the more losses the failing counterparty will incur. So what are the risks and potential adverse behavioral impacts of the CSDR mandatory buy-in regime? This is something we've looked at quite closely with our members, and we think there are a number of key concerns for market efficiency, stability, and liquidity. You start with the cash compensation. This actually creates risks for investors, firms that purchase securities. If they are failed to, they don't actually know if they own the security outright until, under mandatory buy-ins, until it settles. In the event that it goes to cash compensation, they could be adversely impacted, even though they're not the cause of the fail. They have to buy in their counterparty, whether they want to or not, whether it makes economic sense to do so or not. If buy-in isn't possible, they will be awarded cash compensation. Now, in the case of a falling market, because of the asymmetry, you could argue that they will be advantaged unfairly. They will actually make money from something that they ordinarily wouldn't. But in the event of a rising market, there is a chance that they will end up with no securities and will be cash comped based on a price over which they have little or no control. In the event that this is a contingent trade, say it's hedged, say there involves an FX swap, an interest rate swap, CDS, maybe the sale of another security as a hedge, they're now left with these positions which they have to unwind. Thus, actually, the mandatory buy-in regime with cash compensation could put the investors who it's intended to protect at more risk. Investors are also disadvantaged indirectly through liquidity considerations. Market makers run the risk of being bought in at any time. They generally provide liquidity by selling securities that they don't own. In dealer-driven markets, such as corporate bond markets, emerging markets, bond markets in general, the ability to short sell is critical for providing liquidity. In a mandatory buy-in regime, not only is the probability of being bought in increased due to the prescriptive timelines, but the possibility of significant losses arising from the asymmetry compound those risks. In 2015, ICMA conducted a market impact study where we surveyed market makers across a range of bond asset classes to find out the potential impacts. Surprisingly, the results showed two significant increases in offer-time prices to investors for all liquid securities. For less liquid securities, it becomes much more binary. Essentially, you start moving towards a long-only market where market makers will not sell short. They will only provide offers in securities that they hold in inventory. It also creates risks to lenders of securities, even where SFTs are out of scope. And this is largely due to the asymmetry. If you think about a holder of securities who lends them out, they subsequently sell those securities and they don't come back, they now run the risk of being bought in. Now, it may be possible that any buying costs could be passed on through a GMRA or MSLA, not the asymmetry. That's an exposure that they cannot pass on. So in a falling market, if you are failed to on your recall on a security, you face some significant market risk. As mentioned, pass-ons may no longer be possible, and we'll look at an example of a pass-on under conventional buying mechanisms in a moment. It becomes really, really difficult to settle multiple transaction chains where you have fails under mandatory binds. This is because the prescriptive timeline means that every settlement date will produce its own buy-in. There is no discretion as to when to initiate the buy-in. And as we'll also see, due to the asymmetry, even when you have the same settlement date, it may not be possible to use a wait for a mandatory buy-in, and it may be better to actually use a contractual buy-in immediately. So again, both of these lead to multiple buy-ins for where are essentially single fails. We'll just very quickly run through the asymmetry on the buy-in chains. So let's look at an example, a very simplified example of a transaction chain. In this case, A sells to B sells bonds to C sells bonds to D, all at different prices. We can see the P&L profile on the right-hand corner from that original trade using a mark-to-market of, in this case, 99. Under a conventional buy-in, it would be possible where A starts a fails chain, where A fails to B, who fails to C, who fails to D. It's possible for a single buy-in to settle the entire transaction chain and to restore everybody in the chain to the original economics. And it actually works in practice. It works under the ICMA buy-in rules, for instance. How does this work? Well, firstly, the incentive to initiate the buy-in will always lie with the counterparty at the end of the chain, not the counterparty in the middle. If you have a failing receipt and a failing delivery, there is no incentive to initiate a buy-in. If you're at the end of the chain, where you just have a failing purchase, there is every incentive to initiate a buy-in. So in this case, D appoints a buy-in agent to buy-in C. C will pass this on to B, and B will pass this on to A. Essentially, if you receive a buy-in against a failing sale, but you have a failing receipt, you can simply pass on the buy-in instruction. When the buy-in is executed, in this case, 98, the difference between the buy-in price and the original transaction price, again, passes down the chain. It is settled on a transaction-by-transaction basis. So D will settle between C based on the original transaction price, C with B on the original transaction price, and B and A on their original transaction price. Again, everybody is restored to the position they would have been in, and importantly, D gets the securities. Nobody is unfairly disadvantaged, and nobody receives any windfall profits. How would this work under a CSDR mandatory buy-in? Well, first of all, as mentioned, if the various trades in the chain are on different settlement dates, it breaks down immediately because each settlement date will have its own buy-in. Let's assume for a moment that, somewhat unrealistically, that all the trades are for the same settlement date. Well, now we have a problem because it's a falling market and the buy-in price is lower than any of the original transaction prices, which means if you try to apply a pass-on, it wouldn't work because everybody in the chain would just end up canceling a trade and every transaction or the settlement would be deemed paid. You can see the P&L impacts on the right. So B, for instance, who buys at 98.50 and sells at 98.25, they originally booked a 25 cents loss. Well, under a mandatory buy-in, their loss will get wiped out. C, however, is not so lucky. C made a profit. C bought at 98.25 and sold at 98.75. They booked a 50 cents profit. That profit will get wiped out if you apply CSDR mandatory buy-in logic. In other words, in a falling market, counterparties in a chain who had absolutely nothing to do with the fail will have the economics of their original trade changed. Profits will get wiped out, but somewhat bizarrely, so will losses. So I mentioned the risks of lending securities. And again, I want to emphasize this is nothing to do with SFTs or Inscope. This is out of scope SFTs, particularly short-dated loans or loans that are on open. Now, these risks exist today. If you lend securities, there is a chance they might not come back, which causes you to fail on an onward delivery. But generally, these risks are considered to be low. Buy-ins are relatively rare, they're discretionary, and also any costs arising from the buy-in may be possible to pass on through the mini closeout provisions in your repo or lending agreement. That won't work in a falling market, because in a falling market, due to the asymmetry, if you don't get your securities back, you may be able to pass on any buying costs through the GMRA or GMSLA provisions, but you won't be able to pass on the costs incurred through the asymmetry. So again, the asymmetry creates risks to lending and liquidity. So what about Inscope SFTs? Again, there are a number of challenges. For instance, a regular cash buy-in, if you issue a buy-in, you cancel the original trade. What do you do if you buy in against a repo? Do you just cancel the start leg, or do you cancel the entire trade? Well, you would assume that you just cancel the start leg. That would ensure that the counterparty doing the buy-in is pretty much in the same position. But what if it results in cash compensation? i.e. they don't get securities, they just get cashed out. What happens to the end leg then? There is no guidance on this, and it doesn't seem as if the level 1 architects really thought about it. Also, how is the settlement of the buy-in and cash compensation determined? What price is it based on? As we know, SFTs tend to use prices based off market. There's generally no end price. It's just the price plus accrued plus repo interest. Also, prices generally have haircuts. How do you compensate for the haircut? Again, there's no guidance on this. How do you apply the asymmetry against SFTs? Open trades. What happens if an open trade reaches 30 business days? Does it suddenly become in scope? Well, if you're lending securities, you would like to hope not. But if you're borrowing securities, you might want them to be in scope. If you're lending securities and it's deemed that once an open trade reaches 30 business days, it's in scope, you have the option to close it out. But then this creates a conflict of interest with the borrowing counterparty. There are also issues around CCP netting pools for in and out of scope SFTs. Currently, CCPs will net SFTs and cash trades together, start legs and end legs for SFTs. Once you end up with in and out of scope consideration for SFTs, these are going to have to be separated out. This means 2 separate netting pools, which means more costs for clearing. From a trading perspective, for liquidity providers on repo and securities lending desks, they're now going to have to manage risk on a portfolio of transactions, some of which will be in scope of buy-ins and some which will be out of scope. This creates even more issues. And all of these issues and more are discussed in a paper we're about to publish this week, a discussion paper on CSDR mandatory buy-ins and SFTs. We're hoping that this will basically lay out some of the key challenges, which we can then build on and work with ICMA through the level 3 process to try and find clarity and helpful guidance on many of these issues. So what is ICMA doing about CSDR and settlement discipline mandatory buy-ins? Well, first of all, we're trying to raise awareness. We're trying to make sure that our members, wherever they are globally, are aware of the scope, the details, as well as the potential implications. There seems to be a huge information gap in terms of the scope and application and implications as well. We're also working to support implementation. So we're working very closely with other associations, AFME being a key partner. And we're trying to find ways of implementing regulation as smoothly as possible. Now, for bond markets, one obvious way would be to align the ICMA plan rules, CSDR framework. One of the things we're in discussion with ESMA about is a possibility of aligning the ICMA BIOM rules, but dealing with the asymmetry, i.e. having a contractual means whereby counterparties can settle the buy-in differential in both directions. Now, there still remains a conflict of interest. In a falling market. You might rather go with the CSDR option rather than a contractual commitment to keep the original economics of the trade. But from a market stability perspective and a market efficiency perspective, and to support continued liquidity provision, it may be better that we actually find a way of addressing this asymmetry. We'll also continue advocacy with regulators. I just mentioned that we hope to talk to ESMA about how buy-ins are intended to be applied to SFTs, for instance. However, we will keep pushing home the important message that was outlined in our position paper of 2016, that whilst we fully support settlement discipline, we believe there are other means of doing this. We believe that cash penalties with an appropriate calibration could have a very powerful impact on improving settlement discipline. However, the mandatory buy-in regime will not and will actually cause more problems than it solves. We did have a working group focused on these various aspects. Members are encouraged to join, or at least add themselves to the mailing list. And we look forward to continuing our work with our members on this important topic. So in conclusion, CSDR settlement discipline is due to come into force from September 2020. It does provide regulatory obligations for parties to buy in their failing counterparties. The obligation is based on the jurisdiction of CSD and the nature of the underlying security or transaction. It is regardless of the domicile or jurisdictions of the trading parties. Regulation sets out very precise guidelines on the buy-in process, including very prescriptive timings. There is a problematic asymmetry in how the buy-in cash flows are settled. This will generate windfall profits for failed to parties under certain circumstances, but also creates additional market risks and losses for the failing parties. And this has serious implications for liquidity provision and also for repo and lending securities. Unfortunately, this is understood to be the unintended consequence of a level 1 drafting error that cannot be changed. As mentioned, we believe that largely due to the asymmetry, but also the mandatory nature, we will see adverse behavioral incentives